You're watching HuffPost Live. I'm Nancy Red, and in the U.S., approximately 20% of children have a learning disability. But just because these youngsters may be different from some of their peers doesn't mean that they can't flourish inside and outside of the classroom. In his new book, Thinking Differently, David Flink offers parents guidance on understanding and accepting their children's learning disabilities and successfully advocating on their behalf. And David joins us now to discuss. Hello.
Hey there.
This is such an important conversation. Like I told you before, I have a 7-month-old and a 3.5-year-old.
Yep.
We're just beginning their academic journey. So what can parents expect from this book? Because most of the people picking up your book are going to be bummed.
Yeah. Well, let me tell you, you said you're just beginning, right? This is the book I wish my parents had when I began my learning journey. Because 1 in 5 people have learning differences, and most parents don't even know what that means.
They don't know what that means, and also they also think that they think the worst.
Right.
Or they don't have time to shuffle through the red tape, and they don't have a guidebook. This is kind of a guidebook.
This is a guidebook, and it's a guidebook to unpack the words. So, learning disability, let's start there. Those are scary words. Like, my kid goes to school. What's your kid's job at school? To learn.
To learn.
Right?
And if you got a disability, obviously you can't do it well.
Right. And to be honest, that was the label I got in the 5th grade. And I spent a lot of my time feeling like I didn't belong there. So this book is really a chance for parents to see that there's a different answer. There's a different way to go through school besides feeling learning disabled. While learning disabilities are real, you don't have to feel broken in school. Parents don't need to feel that way about their kids, and kids don't need to feel that way.
And like you said, this is from personal experience.
Yeah.
You're not just talking at parents. You're talking from the perspective of the kid with what you wish you had had growing up, with what you needed, and what did help you to achieve.
Yep. So, I was the kid who didn't sit still in school, who didn't read immediately. I spent an awful lot of time in the hallway getting in trouble. And when I got those labels of dyslexia and ADHD, I then had a sense of what I could do in school, and this is really my experiences. So, a couple of things. As soon as I understood I was dyslexic, I became comfortable reading with my ears. People often think about reading as it has to happen with your eyes. Almost everything I read with my ears. I just listen to it, and that's fine. So these are the kind of skills that I lay out in the book, and this is stuff that if my parents knew when I was a kid, it would have been just so much easier for them and for me.
We were talking earlier, and when I was growing up, my mom always says that people wanted to put me on medication. They wanted to treat me as though I had ADHD.
Right.
It would have been a different conversation. I don't know if my path would have been the same, but we had a couple comments coming in. One from Nikon. Man, I had ADHD back when it was still just ADD, and we're seeing a hierarchy and a trend of labeling people,
Yep.
but not necessarily results. There are a lot of labels.
Right.
And a lot of medication, but not necessarily fruitful efforts.
Yep. Well, starting with your story, right? You would have been a kid who had some kind of label, but you didn't even have that label. So there's value in understanding the label. So if you don't have the label of ADHD, you end up getting some other label. For me, it was crazy. I was often labeled as crazy. I was highly impulsive, so it wasn't necessarily off base. But having that label of ADD, which was actually the label I had too, gave me access to a community. It's not so much a condition, but a community. I found out, okay, if I don't think about this as this isolating experience that 1 in 5 people in this classroom have this, then suddenly there's all these people who learn like I do, and yeah, medication will help me sit and focus, but also it's okay to use a squish ball. And I learned that from my community. I learned that it was okay when I saw other kids using a squish ball as well. So this conversation of medication, I think, is a very isolating one, and we have to move it to one about community.
Right. So I think that's one of the aspects that makes your approach different with this book. So what are some other approaches that you do differently?
Yep. Well, I do a lot of things differently, but an awful lot of things differently.
Well, the book is called Thinking Differently.
Yeah, I think differently for sure. So to broaden this a little bit from even just my experience, I have the privilege of working in a nonprofit called Eye to Eye. Mm-hmm. It's a national mentoring program that matches college students who have dyslexia and ADD and other types of learning disabilities with little kids that have the exact same kind of learning disability. And so being with these students for the past 15 years, and being one of them, I've gotten a lot of knowledge from my community about what works. And one of the things I've learned is not so much a specific tool, but a specific sense of your tools. So the reason why I call the book Thinking Differently and not Learning Disabilities, besides the fact that that title would have sucked if I just called it Learning Disabilities, but Thinking Differently was about how are all the ways that we think differently. And I spent a lot of time in the book actually helping parents understand how can they unpack how their kid thinks beautifully, wonderfully, in fact. And maybe there's a little bit that needs a little tweaking around the edges, and then there's some tools about that too. So it's a balance about celebrating gifts and mitigating weaknesses.
When also fighting for what your child needs. Like you
Yeah.
just mentioned, you read with your ears.
Right.
With this going to be something that's going to take a lot to get the teacher used to,
Yep.
you needing that, but recognizing it, fighting for it, can just make a world of difference. Being an advocate is such a scary and daunting task for someone who's just trying to be a parent.
Oh yeah, and some of the ability to use the tools of reading with your ears, right? There's a self-esteem piece to that. I had to find out that I was a good learner. I had to find that out through success. So as I got older, I started doing things that I was good at, and it was almost like I had like a little piggy bank full of self-esteem. And whenever I had to do something that was a little different than my peers, I pulled out a little bit of that, what I would call social currency. But I had to have people put in, social currency back in that piggy bank. And that was my parents, that was my friends, that was my teachers. And in many ways, it's the work that we do in Eye to Eye, but it's the work of this book. I mean, I want parents to see this book and to understand that, they can be this kid. They can raise this kid.
Absolutely. Well, we have some people who really can't wait to talk to you about this book. First, we have a question coming in from HuffPost community member Ivana. Let's take a listen.
Another question I have is when your child goes off to college, how do you help your child to determine special education friendly colleges and universities where they will take into consideration the mental health diagnoses of special education, ADHD, bipolar, depression, so forth, so that they will implement the accommodations the child needs in order to succeed?
Well, I know right now there are probably a ton of parents across America thinking about this question because college applications start getting due towards the end of Christmas, which is not exactly a fun holiday gift for families. So the first thing that all families should know is all colleges are required to provide a support network. As you're looking at schools, you should actually find out about those networks because not all networks are equal. Go to the Disability Service Office at every college. Every college has one, and find out the people who are going to be behind providing those accommodations.
Well, even just giving them a call, you can probably tell a lot from there. If you call and they sound like they just do not have it together, that's a sign.
Yep.
Whereas if you call and they instantly are on board giving this information, that's a sign that this might be a great fit for your child.
And I would also, it's a great opportunity to have a conversation with your kid about how they like to learn. So for instance, when I applied to college, I got into a bunch of different places, but the two probably most different schools was Brown University and Georgia Tech. I say they were different because Brown University had no core curriculum, so no structure. Georgia Tech was an engineering school, tons and tons of structure, and I was trying to decide between these two schools, which was I going to fit in best. And I called the disability service offices and I asked them what kind of accommodations that they provide, and they all said the same thing. They said, oh, well, at Brown we give you extra time. Well, at Georgia Tech we give you extra time too. All right, well, can I get a note taker? Both said yes. And then I paused for a second. I said, well, how do I like to learn? Well, I like to learn like what we're doing right now. I like to learn through conversation. Georgia Tech was known for having very big classes, lots of standardized tests. Brown was known for having small classes that you can walk up to a teacher and say, can I do an independent study? Guess where I ended up? I went to Brown, and it made a world of difference. I mean, it literally set me on my trajectory for the rest of my life.
And so many parents aren't thinking that. They're just thinking, let me get my child into college, not thinking what will their interaction with their peers, with their classmates be. And in particular, teachers. Now, obviously not just for college students, but also for elementary and high school and middle school. Teachers play such an important role in this conversation. And they're an important part of the conversation regardless of one's learning ability, but especially when you know that in some areas you might be at a disadvantage.
And I think that there's a lot of blaming that happens, right? There's a lot of finger pointing, like this teacher didn't give my kid what he or she needed. And the chance that you have actually with a teacher is to take your kid in and have a conversation with the teacher about what works best. What are you seeing work at home? I mean, some of the things in this book are actually unpacking those things that you see at home and bringing them into the classroom. I know my mom's a teacher. She's been a teacher for for a number of decades. And she shows up every day wanting every kid to be successful, and that is every teacher across America. No teacher wants anything less than exceptional greatness from their kids. So helping the student come in with the parent to have that initial dialogue will set the kid on a trajectory for success, particularly if you can learn it at a young age.
All right, well, speaking of teachers, I have 2 questions from 8th grade teacher Chelsea Fuller. She teaches English. Let's see what she wants to know.
As a teacher, it's in the classroom a lot of times where we recognize the first signs that a student may have a learning disability. When that is presented to parents, oftentimes some parents are reluctant to have their student tested or feel as though they don't want their student classified under such disabilities. So what advice also would you give to a teacher in terms of presenting or recommending that a student be tested for a learning disability?
Well, Chelsea,
Huge point.
oh my gosh, what a great point, and what a great question, right? Because almost always it is a teacher that kind of identifies it first, and I think there's so much misunderstanding and stigma attached to the label that parents often run away from it. So one thing I actually did in writing this book is give this as a tool to give to parents. I hope teachers feel comfortable doing that. The second thing is offering stories. So I remember for me as a kid, my teacher said, well, Dave learns differently and we think he might have dyslexia, and it's just like Tom Cruise. For me as a kid, there was no one cooler than Tom Cruise. Top Gun had just come out, it was amazing, right? And it was a scaffolding of things. It was Tom Cruise, and it was also, Cousin Jimmy. So having a variety of people that are real people that can be success models is super important.
All right, Chelsea has one more question. She can tell she's a very dedicated teacher.
Awesome, Chelsea, what you got?
In addition to the strategies that you suggest for teaching and parenting to support students with learning differences and disabilities, do you suggest any new policies that should be put in place to support this specific population as well?
If I had to say one thing, and it's actually a system that's in place but it's not being used, it's having kids be a part of their IEP process. So an IEP is a plan that gets put in place in a school where it sort of individualizes the way a kid goes through their schooling, but a lot of times the kids aren't in that. It happens between a parent and a school. And so because that policy is happening without a kid involved, the kid doesn't feel like they are a part of their education. They feel like they are a subject of their education. So I think the more we can include kids in the IEP process, the better.
All right, well, so that's one thing that people need to do. What are other huge do's? When we're talking about the takeaways from your book for parents who are dealing with a child with a learning disability, include their child.
Yep. Well, let's first get them diagnosed. I think Chelsea brought that up really well. Let's get them diagnosed at a young age. I like the word identified. I think it feels less medical, but at some level it needs to be a diagnosis. Number 2, let's play with the skills that they already have. So let's think about their giftedness. Where are they excelling? Then let's match that to their accommodations. And accommodations is a weird word for a little kid to know, but it's literally as simple as what we've been talking about.
Squeeze ball.
Yeah, squeeze ball, using your iPod to listen to the book instead of reading it with your eyes. Whatever it is, it might be extra time. And then the last piece, if we only said one more, is advocacy. At some point, the kids need to learn to ask for these things by themselves. Because when they get to college, guess what? Mom or dad hopefully isn't coming with them. So if they have some practice doing that, they'll do better when they get to college.
And also teach them not to have shame, to speak up. Say, hey, look, this is a part of me. This is important. Yeah. My success is valuable.
I am here today so that parents know that they are not alone and that those kids are not alone. They can say, hey, I met this guy, Dave, met him on TV, but here I am. We actually have a billboard going up in Times Square today. It's all faces of young people who have learning differences because we want them to know they're not alone and they look like every one of us.
Absolutely. It's something you cannot just tell looking at someone whether or not they're dealing with a learning disability. What are things you see a lot of parents doing that they shouldn't?
They self-blame. I see a lot of parents blame themselves somehow.
Only I hadn't had that coffee in the first trimester.
Right, exactly. And you know what's interesting? So there's a 70% chance that if you have a learning difference, your kid has a learning difference. And I joke sometimes that learning differences are hereditary. We get them from our kids, because the kid gets diagnosed and then the parent finds out. And then they think, well, then this is really my fault. No, this is exceptional. Some of the most brilliant minds in our society have learning differences. Chuck Schwab, Whoopi Goldberg, Paul Orfalea, the founder of Kinko's. But also we know that the outcomes aren't always so great for kids who learn differently if we don't get the successful tools in place at a young age. So the parents need to not blame themselves and maybe look at their own success. Look at what works for them in their own life. And if there are things that didn't work for them, don't make their kids do it the same way.
Now, specifically when talking about ADHD, what are some do's and don'ts there? Because that's a different animal than so many other learning disabilities.
Yeah. Number one, we talked a little bit about medicine, but I want to go deeper. Medicine is a neutral thing. People love to go on one side of it. It's horrible, it's going to screw up my kid, or it's wonderful, it's a savior. It's the middle. It's the tool. So I think in terms of ADHD, not being scared of the medication is really great. I think about it like a ramp into school. It's a ramp into my brain. It slows things down. It helps me focus for the 8-hour day that we have ahead of us. So taking that piece and just putting that in a box is one of the tools. I would also say additional tools. Understanding that kids maybe need to have a little physicality. They need to get up and move around. And by the way, that's actually true for most kids. I can't believe we ask kids to sit still all day long. You have 2 kids, right? Do they sit still ever?
Oh, I don't even.
Never. They're moving right now.
They're probably under this desk.
Yes, I know. The desk would be moving, right? Exactly. So understanding that we have to let kids be kids. And then, the last thing I'd say on ADHD, because there's this sort of tangential way of thinking, that's a beautiful thing. Let's not criticize kids for that. Let's celebrate it. Let's figure out where that tangential thinking goes.
And let's hope it becomes the next Facebook.
Yeah.
Or the next best-selling book. We're so excited to have you here. I think this is extremely important. It's great to have it from the perspective that you bring. Thank you so much. Now, for more on David's work in his book, Thinking Differently, check out the links in our resource well below. And stay tuned because the conversation always continues here at HuffPost Live.